Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery Heritage Manager.
And my name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it to R. So my R is rabies. I'll start off by, I'm sure everybody knows, but just to start off with the basics, one of the main symptoms of rabies is an inability to swallow. And you'll often see this kind of stereotyped in films or novels. If somebody has rabies, they become very afraid of water. Now, this can be sort of exaggerated for dramatic effect, but it is a genuine symptom of rabies. So, what this leads to in the history of medicine is a lot of that like-for-like treatment, which we've talked about before. So, if you want to cure someone of rabies, supposedly, you would hold them underwater, according to the ancient Romans, which feels quite unpleasant. It's unpleasant generally, and especially unpleasant if you're very afraid of water. By the medieval period, they're going a little bit further, and they're literally throwing people into ponds, lowering them into wells, or just making them drink water. While this all sounds awful, one of the positives is that an awful lot of people that they thought had rabies definitely didn't actually have rabies. So I suppose they're just throwing people into ponds for no reason. But I think there was a lot of confusion about what was, because rabies is largely caused by being bitten by an animal with rabies. People associate it mentally mostly with dogs, but it's being bitten by all sorts of mammals that have. And the challenge is, at the time, how do you tell the difference between a dog that's just very angry and a dog that actually has rabies? And it wasn't very easy to tell. So a lot of the time they were assuming that people had rabies when they didn't. But yes, it could be, mad chickens or mad cats or mad bats. But when it's written about in recipes, it's almost always talked about as being the bite of the mad dog. There is some theoretical writing about the idea that perhaps early European ideas around werewolves were influenced by the behaviour of rabid dogs and rabid wolves. I'm not sure there's a huge amount of evidence for that, but that is a theory. But although cases of rabies were never actually huge, there were never that many people dying of rabies, certainly by comparison to the number of people who were dying of typhus and cholera and smallpox and dozens of other things. But it was the fear that was the issue. So even though it didn't happen very often, people were very, very afraid of it. People talked about it a lot. People wrote about it a lot. So it built a reputation around it, this fear of rabies. And so you would get it in plays and novels and songs and so on. And there's a few reasons why it was particularly scary, one of which was it was difficult to know when you had contracted rabies. Another thing that made it very scary was rabies was always fatal. If it was a genuine bite of a rabid dog, it was 100% of the time fatal. And the only reason that any of the recipes that were written about mad dog bites were actually believed to work was because they were misdiagnosing it. The people who were cured were people who never actually had rabies in the first place. They'd just been bitten by an angry dog. But the other weird thing about rabies in comparison to every other disease that people were aware of is that it could take up to a year for it to manifest. So it's not that you get bitten by a rabid dog and then hours later or even days later, you show symptoms of rabies. It lasts for a really long time with, in essentially a dormant state. So it was very difficult to know the fear was hanging over you because who knew if that dog that bit you 6 months ago had been rabid or not? You had to just wait and see what happened. So all these factors kind of came together to give people a lot of fear around it. And there were a lot of strange myths as well. So there was an idea that sensitive people were more prone to rabies. If a woman was bitten by a rabid dog, she was more likely to get rabies than if a man was. A red-haired woman was especially likely to develop rabies for reasons, because that was sort of the mythology that built up around it. It was also thought to be more common during heat. Rabies was somehow, according to this theory, sort of generated by heat. And so what were called the dog days of summer were the main risk period for rabies, according to this theory. And again, the fear is so bad that people even said, well, if you were walking around barefoot and you stood on a place where a rabid dog had urinated, then the rabies would go through your foot and into your bloodstream. One text I found said that eating cashew nuts could also cause rabies. So there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. But because I do love a list, I did make a list of some things that were supposed to be treatments for rabies. And these were mostly either rubbed into the wound from the bite or ingested, because often with rabies, you find it difficult to swallow, as I mentioned. So quite a few of them were used as suppositories. So just bear that in mind. So the list includes ash of a mouse's tail, crabs caught under a full moon, sheep dung, human dung, salted fish, which actually seems a lot better than everything else under that list, dried weasels, crushed ants, nettles, and the kind of the hallmark of every good recipe, the urine of a young man mixed with butter.
Of course.
Of course, you can't. It's everywhere. It's unfortunately. You could put hot bricks on your feet. You could also put, and I feel like we've had this treatment for something else in the podcast, and I can't remember what. Place either a live chicken or a live kitten's anus onto the bite, and it will suck out the
We had it that was the Black Death, I think, or like the plague. It was, you supposed to put the chicken on the bubo and it would magically transfer.
I knew we'd had that before. But I mean, the good thing is, if that makes anyone squeamish, nothing bad happens to the kitten. Like, the kitten might be a bit weirded out, but the kitten isn't hurt. It's kept alive. It's just somehow it's sucking the poison out. It's probably not going to be very happy at the end of it, but it's not going to be hurt. And again, because there was a lot of like for like medicine, there were a lot of things like place a dog's tongue in your shoe. Hair of the dog is one that comes up. Now, we might know that in a modern context to do with having a drink after having drunk too much alcohol. But hair of the dog is literally take the hair of the dog and lay it on the wound or eat it. And it has to be the hair of the dog that bit you, so not just any dog. And also, if you can get the dog that bit you, I mean, good luck if it's a rabid dog, but you can also use the dung of the dog, the blood of the dog, the liver of the dog, or even eat the entire head of the dog. Which feels a bit like, okay, so if you stand in its urine, then it'll give you rabies, but you can eat an entire head of it and it'll be fine.
It's interesting that the connection there between that phrase and hair of the dog. So it must just mean using the thing that did the damage to make the cure, I guess.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to pretend that I 100% know that for sure, but that is what is happening, so that makes a lot of sense. Mercury is also used. It's thought, because of the problem with swallowing, it's thought that there is some sort of problem with the saliva or with the mouth, and so mercury is used for that. But there's a lot of sort of politics, I suppose, going on behind it. All of this happening, this fear of rabies, this rabies becoming increasingly something that's talked about in the media or in the press in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, is that underlying all of this, there is a growth of the middle class. There's a huge growth in dog ownership. People, increasingly owning a dog was associated with high status, disposable income. It was aspirational. And there was an argument that this focus on rabies was also a fear of the working class. When people talked about rabid dogs, there was genuinely an idea that only dirty dogs or poor people's dogs or dogs that lived in certain places were going to get rabies. So it was a sort of, dogs are not for you. You can't look after them. These are not your sort of pets or something that you're allowed to have. There was a lot of writing about the fact here that mongrel dogs were more likely to be rabid than pedigree dogs. There is no science behind that.
A weird bit of elitism there.
Absolutely. Oh, people can find anything to be elitist about.
My dog's too posh to get rabies.
Yeah, exactly.
Or I'm too posh for my dog to get rabies.
Well, indeed. You can bring class and elitism into anything, and actually, because of in the kind of bigger picture of the 19th century, there is a lot of sort of nasty eugenic stuff. There's a lot of stuff around racial purity, phrenology. The same language is used when discussing rabies. You know, it is this idea that it is tied in with impurity and, you know, the wrong type of person, essentially. You know, subverting sort of the natural social order. In the 1790s in Britain, a dog tax is introduced. And the purpose of it essentially is to make owning a dog expensive. And you had to pay to be allowed to have a dog. And if you couldn't pay, you weren't allowed. Now, it was very, very difficult to actually, you know, effectively implement. So it never really worked. But the fact that they even tried to do that is a sign of you know, this idea that poor people shouldn't own dogs, and somehow poor people's dogs were more of a risk than other people's dogs. So the big sort of culmination of all of this is the creation of the rabies vaccine. Now, there is a picture of the 19th century French chemist Louis Pasteur, he of, you know, pasteurization fame, which is quite, I was going to say famous, but it's quite well used. When people write about Pasteur, they often use this particular image. And it's an illustration which shows him in a laboratory. He's sort of at the front of the frame, the laboratory's behind him, and he's holding up a bottle in his hand and looking at it. And it makes him look very sort of, you know, pensive, thoughtful, scientist in action. And this image is used often to illustrate articles about the work he did on pasteurization, which is the thing that he is most famous for. But what the image is actually showing is Pasteur holding up a bottle with a rabies-infected spinal cord in it. Because the other thing Pasteur did, aside from pasteurization, was develop the rabies vaccine. So yeah, if you look closely at that image, you might not realize it, but yes, that's a little bit of spinal cord in his hand, which is lovely. But it's an interesting image because it's quite bold, because at the point at which that painting was made, he had not proven that his vaccine worked. So this image is essentially marketing. He's trying to show his supporters, his financial backers, look at this fantastic thing that he's doing, it's definitely going to succeed, but actually it had not yet worked. This was essentially him trying to market and promote something which he had not yet done. So, and the reason the vaccine works is it's not like other vaccines in the sense of you don't take it as a preventative. You take it when you have been bitten by a mad dog. And the reason why it is able to work is because of the long delay. So once you've been bitten, you have weeks, possibly months, between the bite and the symptoms first appearing. So that is when you need to get your vaccination. So it could make you immune to rabies after you had been bitten. And so what would happen is somebody got bitten, and then they would, initially when he was the only person who had this vaccine, later of course it's disseminated out, they would rush to France. They would, you know, get on the first boat to France and rush into the room and go, please give me the vaccine. So his work was not just about creating a vaccine, it was also about understanding the virus. So people had previously thought, or some people had thought, that rabies spontaneously generated in dogs that were, as I said, badly cared for, you know, malnourished. But he showed it only occurred when an animal had been bitten. So it wasn't only humans that needed to be bitten, it was the dogs that needed to be bitten as well, which might seem glaringly obvious, but as I say, at the time there was a lot of idea that it just sort of generated automatically if a dog was not cared for. So he really kind of changed people's understanding of the disease and took away the idea that it was something that was specifically a sort of a working class condition, I suppose. So what's your R then, Olivia?
I've gone for rosacea. So rosacea is a common skin condition. It usually affects the parts of your face like your nose, cheeks, and your forehead, but other areas like your neck and upper chest, back, and ears can sometimes become involved. It's sometimes called acne rosacea, as it can look similar to acne, and the main symptoms are frequent flushing, redness, small red bumps, and tiny visible blood vessels. Less commonly, it can cause a thickening of the skin, which can result in a bulbous or bumpy nose called rhinophyma, and that tends to affect men more than women. People might develop eye symptoms as well, like dryness, sensitivity to light, burning, stinging, or itching eyes. Around 1 in 20 people in the UK are thought to develop rosacea, but many cases are mild. Symptoms usually appear in middle age, between the ages of 30 and 40, because in general, it affects women more than men and often starts with temporary flushes that come and go. It's sometimes mistaken for menopausal flushes in women. This is an unusual one because the exact cause of rosacea isn't really known. There are a number of triggers, including aerobic exercise, alcohol, caffeine, cheese, hot drinks, spicy food, stress, and sun exposure. And although rosacea appears to run in some families, there's no known genetic link. There's a little bit about what rosacea is. To go to the history, because that's the bit that we like. Diseases of facial skin have been mentioned repeatedly in medical history, dating back to physicians in ancient Greece and Rome, where management of facial skin conditions such as acne usually involved the application of honey, soaps, and mineral waters. In Celsus's De Medicina, he also mentions baths containing sulfur for cleaning and drying out the skin. And it's thought that rosacea may have been mentioned by Theocritus in the 3rd century BCE. I couldn't find any more other than possibly mentioned by this guy. Most early references to flushed skin tended to describe a symptom rather than an overall condition. And the language around facial redness in general is interesting. So, blushes is seen as a reddening, usually of the cheeks, and it tends to be an expression of embarrassment or stress caused by emotional triggers. Whereas a flush or flushing typically describes a more intense or widespread redness, often caused by physical factors like heat or exertion. The emotional and physical aspects of the two kind of overlap in the lovely Venn diagram of humoral theory. People with facial redness were sanguine, which made them friendly and jovial, but indicated an excess of blood. So I did find a reference to bloodletting from the face to treat rosacea. Guy de Chauliac, 14th century French surgeon, provides us with the first known medical description of rosacea, and he described red lesions in the face, particularly on the nose and cheeks, and called the condition goutte rose, French for pink droplet, or couperose, now a common French term for rosacea. He suggested that treatment should be a cooling diet, bloodletting from the frontal vein, and the application of leeches in the nostrils and purging. So leeches in the nostrils was...
I feel like with all the disgusting things we've talked about, I should have just come to terms with it all by now, but something about leeches in the nostrils. Yeah, I like it.
Others, such as the 16th century physician Ambrose Paré, he referred to rosacea as gutta rosa, the Latin version of gutta rose, or pustule de vin, French for pimples of wine. In both medical texts and literature, the condition was commonly attributed to the excessive consumption of alcohol. So a clear reference to rosacea-like illness was made in Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which was published in 1387. In his description of the Sumner, along with what seems to be an indication that alcohol was the cause. So he's described as having a fire-red cherubim's face, pimpled and discoloured with swollen eyelids, and no ointment could cure his pustules. He loved garlic, onions, and eke leeks, and for to drink in strong wine red as blood. The early medical writers on rosacea appear to have attached a great deal of importance to alcoholic indulgence as the cause of the condition, so much so that Daniel Tanner, a surgeon writing in the early 18th century, protested against it, saying, "It is certain that it does not always owe its original to hard drinking, since it's sometimes observed to attend the most temperate and abstemious." However, the association persisted, and in 1834, Scottish physician Robert McNish explicitly linked acne rosacea to alcohol consumption in his book, The Anatomy of Drunkenness. He says of the wine bibber, "His nose is well studded over with carbuncles of the claret complexion, and the red of his cheeks resembles very closely the hue of that wine." In 1812, the term acne rosacea first appeared in a medical text by English dermatologist Dr. Thomas Bateman, who noted that the perfect cure for acne of rosacea is, in fact, never accomplished. Other 19th century references commonly listed rosacea among the different forms of acne as well. Another reference was made to the condition in the 1817 publication on cutaneous diseases by dermatology pioneer Dr. Robert Willen, which included one of the earliest hand-coloured medical illustrations of the condition. In 1891, Dr. Henry G. Prifford, professor of dermatology in New York, called for distinctions among different forms of acne to more truly differentiate symptoms. Today, dermatologists have learned that rosacea is a different disease from acne, and that therapy for acne can often make it worse. Although the precise cause of rosacea is still unknown, most experts believe that it's a vascular disorder that seems to be related to flushing. Research has also dispelled the centuries-old myth that rosacea is caused by heavy consumption of alcohol. While alcohol might aggravate the condition, the symptoms can be just as severe in a teetotaler. And I've got some general facts. Do you want some general facts? Sorry.
Go on, give us some general facts.
So in the past, treatments for acne rosacea included salves containing mercury, which I think was used to soften the skin, and sulfur, which we know was used to dry out the skin, as well as bloodletting and leeches. Rosacea was sometimes viewed as a condition of the lower classes, particularly of people exposed to the weather or considerable heat, like farmers and cooks. The character of Bardolph in Shakespeare's Henry IV is described as having rosacea characterized by rhinophyma. His inflamed nose and constantly flushed face is a repeated subject for Falstaff and Prince Hal's comic insults and wordplay. Prince Hal imagines that he blushed when he was caught stealing his first alcoholic drink, and the blush stuck. He also mocks Bardolph's heavy drinking habits, implying that his red face, hot liver, is a result of excessive alcohol consumption and will ultimately lead to poverty. One of the most famous depictions of rosacea and rhinophyma is in Domenico Ghirlandaio's The Old Man and His Grandson, which is now housed in the Louvre. And W.C. Fields, a prominent comedian in America, appeared in vaudeville shows, silent films, and talkies, was recognized for his red face owing to rosacea.
So we're finishing up with another R from me, which is Radium Girls. So, quick recap on radium. So, radium is a naturally occurring element, byproduct of the decay of uranium. So, well known to have been discovered by Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie. And in the 20 years that followed, so they discovered it 1898, and in the decades that followed, there were many, many unregulated products, some of which were medical, some of which weren't, which used radium. So radium was everywhere in the early 20th century. By the 1940s, it had become clear that that was problematic and quite risky and quite dangerous. But yeah, there was a good few decades where radium was everywhere. So there was what was called radium quackery. So you could get radium toothpaste, radium face cream. There were radium spas that you could go to, radium cigarettes, radioactive water, radioactive chocolate, radium jewelry, radium basalt, radium milk. There was radium soft drinks, including one I found called Liquid Sunshine. And probably the best of all, radium condoms. I'm enjoying Olivia's facial expression. But I suppose the good news is that a bunch of these probably didn't have any radium in them at all, because it wasn't cheap to do. What was much cheaper was to pretend that your product had radium in it and put that on the packaging, rather than actually sourcing some radium. So not all of them would be as dangerous as they sounded. Now, I should put a disclaimer at this point. Some of the uses of radium were good. So radium, was an effective cancer treatment. It's not, that there are safer substitutes now, but at the time, of what was available, and radium was key in the development of X-rays. So there were purposes where radium was very useful, but there was an awful lot of things like the condoms and the toothpaste which were not. So I should say there's a fantastic book by a woman called Kate Moore called The Radium Girls. So I'm not going to pretend that what I'm about to say is my original research. Definitely check out Kate Moore's book. And it talks about this group of women who were employed from 1916-17 onwards by what was called the US Radium Corporation to paint the dials on watches with radium. The radium made the dials glow, so that was the purpose. It wasn't purely cosmetic. This was wartime, and so having a watch that you could see and you could see the numbers when it was the Blitz or you were at the front or what have you was very useful. But the male engineers who were employed by the company were provided with lead aprons and other safety equipment, and the women were not provided with any protective equipment. And in fact, they were actually advised by their employers to do a thing called pointing. So when you are doing very, very fine work, you put the brush in your mouth to bring the bristles to a point. So you'll be much better at doing the details. So they were advised to do this. They were advised to be putting radium into their mouths sort of regularly as part of their work. And this led to non-healing ulcers, tooth loss, bone cancers, and ultimately death. Your bones would literally crumble. The women locally were known as ghost girls because the radium dust made them glow. Their skin glowed, their hair glowed, their clothes glowed. But at that point, that was so early on, there was so little understanding of the risks that, at least by the public, I mean, there was some growing scientific understanding, but a general public understanding that the women would paint their fingernails with radium. They would sprinkle radium in their hair. They would put it on their teeth. There were examples where women would wear their finest dresses to work so that when they went to the dances later, they would literally glow. An estimated 4,000 women were employed in this work, and the company repeatedly buried reports showing the dangers. And eventually the people who were trying to uncover this were able to carry out an autopsy on one of the women, and they were able to prove. They brought a lawsuit, and they did win, but by the time it made it to court, 2 of the women were completely bedridden, and apparently none of the women could actually raise their hands to take the oath. They were so physically weakened by what had happened to them. So yeah, that is the Radium Girls.
Yeah.
It's bleak, isn't it? I'm sorry, Olivia.
Oh, just...
I think
I know, I was going to say, just to go back to your point about... Made me laugh, the Quid Sunshine drink, because there is a certain drink of my childhood that my mother used to call radioactive that was quite orange coloured, which I won't name, but similarly sunshiny.
Well, not quite similarly, but yes, I take your point. And of course that thing that we keep coming up against, which is that it didn't seem to even cross their minds to give protective equipment to the women, but they did think to give protective equipment to the male engineers. So yes.
Were there... I can't see the logic in the reasoning there, but were the men thought to be more exposed
I think
somehow?
there was an assumption that the quantities that the men were working with, because the men were working with vast amounts, whereas the women were just had little pots and things, and so there was just an idea that the quantity was less, and therefore the risk was less. And there was a claim that they didn't know that the women were, pointing the bristles with their mouths, and they didn't know that the women were, putting it in their hair and things. But I would say that they did know, because they do seem to have actually asked them to do that. But also, it was almost irrelevant at that point, because they were working so closely with this material that even if they hadn't sprinkled it in their hair, it was still going to have that effect by being in such close proximity and working with this material every day. So yeah, I'm sorry, I've gone for a bleak one, but I just found them a very interesting group of women.
Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.